My friends, if you've got Deuteronomy chapter 12 open on your lap, you will find it very helpful as we go through this morning, because we're going to be looking at this passage. So, if you're ready, we'll make a start. We're looking at the book of Deuteronomy through a particular lens. We're using this phrase, God's people are us. The idea being that anything that we have is really to do with God. We're here to glorify Him. And if anyone wants to find out what God is like, he should be able to come into the church and look around and say, yep, that's what God's like. I can see Him in His people. God's people are us. And that's the message of the book of Deuteronomy. What Moses and what God is doing in the book of Deuteronomy is he's taking a dynasty of people who trace their ancestry back to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and he's transforming them into a nation that's going to declare his glory. So they could say, in their day, many hundreds of years ago, God's people are us. And this morning, we're going to be looking at one particular aspect of that. We're going to be looking at transformational worship from Deuteronomy chapter 12. Now actually, chapter 12 starts a new section in the book of Deuteronomy. 1 to 11 we've looked at already. Then there's 12 to 26 is another section, and then 27 to the end. This starts a section where the laws that God has given through Moses are going to be expounded once again for the people to understand and to live by. You see, the main purpose of the children of Israel was to proclaim the wonder of God to the surrounding nations. And we're going to see some of that coming out as we go through this morning. Before we launch into that, however, I want to introduce to you a technical term. Don't you just love those words? When we were planning this, when Andy and I were talking about the series, one of the phrases that we used was we want to expound Deuteronomy using a missional hermeneutic. Sorry? He said, I feel sorry for you. Yes, I know, a hermeneutic, it sounds like something you want to comb out of your hair, doesn't it? I want to get rid of all these hermeneutics. But actually, it has a very valuable meaning, because it's the word we use to describe the way in which we get the meaning out of the Bible. Started with this chap, Hermes. He was the god, little g, in Greek mythology. He was the messenger god. So if the gods, little g, wanted to get a message across, so their myths said, they will call on Hermes to do the deed. So hermeneutics, that's how we get the message across, how we get the message out of the Bible. That's what your hermeneutic is. And the particular lens, the particular hermeneutic that we're adopting as we're looking at Deuteronomy is a missional hermeneutic. In other words, what does Deuteronomy say about the mission of God's people? About being God's people, but also communicating God to people who aren't. And in actual fact, you don't have to look far in Deuteronomy to see this message coming out time and time and time and time again. It's embedded there in the book all the way through. And that's why we're not bending or distorting the scriptures at all. We're simply taking it at face value when we say we're using a missional hermeneutic to expound the book of Deuteronomy. So the fundamental message is this: that which God called Israel to in history, to be a witness for him, he calls the church to today. That's our hermeneutic. That's the message we're getting out of the Bible. And the method we're using is just by looking at Deuteronomy through this particular lens. So that which God called Israel to in history, he calls us to today. And how's he going to do that? How's he going to proclaim the wonder of who he is to the nearby world? He's going to do it through the local church. And I use the word nearby world deliberately because repeatedly we hear God saying that the purpose of Israel was to declare his greatness to the surrounding nations. Now these nations weren't well-defined geographical entities as we understand them today. They were more like individual cities or groups of towns that had a local leader called a melech or a king. So it was these people around the nation that God was calling Israel to be a witness to. It was their next door neighbours, the people who saw them most, the people who networked and traded with them most easily. They were the centre of God's concern when it came to Israel's witness. So Deuteronomy has a missional hermeneutic all of its own, a declaring God's greatness agenda. And the message is that God wanted to reach the people who were around. And that's my desire in unpacking this book for you. That's why I'm so keen on regular, systematic, expository preaching. Expository means to expose the impact of the text for today, to reveal it, to make it clear. There's a lovely phrase used of Ezra, the priest, where it says, Ezra made sense of the reading. That is what I'd like to do for you. For me, that's my life's purpose. It's to take this book and to make sense of it as best I can as an ordinary bod, but with God's help, I trust. So, what is God, through Moses, saying to the children of Israel as they're starting to rework the law in such a way that they can become a nation? Well, we start off in verse 1. And in verse 1, we're told we're to hear the voice of God. The children of Israel were on the verge of this massive change. They were just poised on the edge of going into the promised land. And so God says to them, verse 1, these are the decrees and laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of our ancestors, has given you to possess, as long as you live in the land. So no equivocating here. This is what we're to listen to. And God is being quite assertive, and he's asserting some key things, even right in this first verse. First of all, he's asserting his authority. These are the decrees and the laws which I'm giving you. He's saying, I am the one you're to follow. Yes, there will be many other competing little gods with a small g that you can follow. But I am the one who deserves your full allegiance, especially in your worship that we're coming on to in a minute. He's asserting his authority. He's also asserting his identity that makes him distinctive from any other god that's around. And we shall look at some of that in a moment. He's also asserting his generosity. I'm the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and I'm giving you this land to possess. You don't earn it by being good. It's being given to you by my grace. This is a statement of God's grace. We've already seen statements of his rescue, his salvation as he's brought them out of Egypt. Now this is a statement of God's generosity. And he's asserting in this new section of the book, as he begins expounding the law a second time, that he is a generous God. Furthermore, he's asserting his jurisdiction. You must live like this as long as you are in the land. Why? Well, because God's vision for the land and its people, i.e. you, is that my name will be seen for the glorious person that I am. He's saying to the children of Israel, you carry my reputation. And in just the same way today, he says to the Church of Jesus Christ, you carry my reputation. So God is addressing his people through Moses so they know how he wants them to live in the land. So what's going to be the major thing? Where's he going to start? Where's the headline news of God beginning to rework his law? Is it going to be their politics? Is it going to be their economics? Is it going to be their government system? No, it's none of the above. Although he does talk about those later. He's going to start with a thing that is to be most important in their national life, and that is their worship. Now, isn't that interesting? We might expect him to start in one of these other places, but God headlines worship. And you may come to me and say, well, Ian, that's all very well, but of course they lived in a different era, a different kind of society, a completely different culture. How we worship is of almost no importance to the vast majority of the population. What we're doing here on Sunday morning is almost irrelevant to 95% of Eastbourne. And I have to say, if you think just in terms of religious ritual, you are sadly right. But worship is something much bigger than that. Yes, of course it includes what we're doing today, and it's wonderful to do it, but it's much bigger than that. Because we all worship someone or something. The thing that I worship is that which comes at the top of my personal agenda. When I have two competing appointments coming up, which one do I choose? That choice may point up what I worship. When you look at your bank account and see how you use your discretionary money, not the money that you have to pay to stay alive, to buy food and pay your rent and so forth, but any discretionary money that you have, optional money, how do you spend it? That might indicate what you worship. Or when it comes to time, particularly free, unallocated time, when you haven't got to work for your employer, that may highlight what you worship. In 2 weeks' time, there is a massive worship event going to start in Brazil. It's called the World Cup. If they can get the stadiums built in time. Don't you wish we had a World Cup with Brazilian passion and English civil engineering? Boy, it would be fantastic. Anyway, that's another story. But that's a massive event where people go and they praise their teams and they praise the game. They even call it the glorious game. That's worship. Now, what Deuteronomy is saying and what the scriptures say to us time and time again is, when it comes to worship, when it comes to your highest allegiance and your deepest commitment, put the living God there. Let him be the focus of your worship. Jesus said, seek first the kingdom of God. And all this other stuff, he's not denigrating the other stuff, all this other stuff will be added to you. But put him first. And then other priorities will come along in their wake. So that's why God, I believe, is starting with the nation's worship when it comes to reworking their laws. And how are they to do this? Well, the succeeding verses that we've just heard read to us give us some clues. So we're to worship the Lord. Verse 2, we're told to do it by removing the competition. Look, destroy completely all the places on the high mountains and on the hills and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in the fire, cut down the idols to their gods. Now, there's a bit of background here which will help us to understand both why God is saying that and also just what he's saying here through Moses. Canaanite worship often took place on the tops of hills or mountains, or it took place under large trees where they could get some shade from the sun. And they would bring offerings to their gods, little g, and go through rituals to try and appease these gods and stay on the right side of them. And they would often evoke the power of their gods to bring about results on the earth, particularly having children. The Baal cult was basically a massive fertility cult. And so when you saw these large, thick poles sticking out of the top of a hill with little piles of stuff beneath them, you can imagine a certain phallic symbol there, and that was entirely intentional. They were intended to be it was intended to be a fertility cult, and they tried to persuade their gods to give them children. And in fact, you can get some idea of what went on at these high places from verse 33, if you look further down in the text. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way, because in worshipping their gods, they do all kinds of detestable things that the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire as sacrifices to their gods. Horrific practices that they engaged in as part of Baal worship. And so God says, destroy all the competition. There is a sense in which we too, when we worship, need to make sure we deal with the competition. Things that distract us. Things that cause our minds to focus on other stuff apart from who the Lord is. So how are they to worship? By removing the competition. Also, we're to worship by using his name. The name really matters. Verse 3 says, wipe out their names from those places, because the name identified the God. To excise their name was to get rid of the personality of this little godlet, little g. However, of course, when we look at what happened in Israel, we can see, if you've ever done a sort of sweep of the Old Testament or had a chance to have a look at this, we can see that that wasn't always the case. And sometimes they kept the names of these heathen gods and even used some of them to refer to Almighty God himself. And it always led them into trouble. Every time they compromised with one of these other gods, they found themselves in trouble. So God is saying, look, please, be radical with the competition, with things that distract. Wipe out even their names from these places. And do it his way, God's way, verse 4. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not for 1 minute saying there's a right and a wrong way to worship the Lord. We engage with him in a huge variety of different ways. And that is influenced by all sorts of things, by your background, by the era in which you were born, by your personality, and even by your musical taste. Actually, more than you think, it's affected by personality. But there are things that the children of Israel were to avoid. Look at verse 4. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way. Some people today, even in Christian circles, think that we should have a greater openness to other religions and the surrounding culture. And they say there is some biblical justification, looking at Israel's history and recognise that they did take on board some of these Baal gods. Looking at Israel's history, they say there is some biblical justification for more of a sort of mix and match. We call it a syncretistic approach to other faiths and religions. I spoke to one minister of a church who, in the name of establishing a good reputation, allowed people from the local mosque to use the hall in his church. They had Muslim artefacts at one end of the room and Christian artefacts at the other. And with some pride, he said to me, so all we have to do is turn the chairs round. And I wanted to say to him, you are a minister of the gospel and you don't get it? This has got nothing to do with being nice to people of other faiths. It's got everything to do with worshipping the Lord and him only. And this is exactly what Deuteronomy is telling us here. This is precisely what God tells the Israelites not to do. If we mix our worship with little bits of other religions and other gods, we lose the uniqueness of the God who made this cosmos and who has redeemed and rescued real people. And I know this is a politically incorrect thing to say today, because this idea that what God is saying here undercuts the whole concept behind pluralism. The idea that there are many faiths and they all witness to some ultimate reality and we'll all get to God in the end. For pluralism, the possibility of one true revelation by one true God, known by one saving name through one particular people, is a complete non-starter. But that's exactly what God is saying here. They say that this idea of there being one God is chauvinistic, it's imperialistic. They say everything in history is relative. There are no absolutes. But actually, of course, anyone who listens to that statement realises that it is in itself an absolute statement. So there's a certain illogicality in that whole approach to philosophy. For the pluralist, then, all the names of God in the religions of humanity have some validity, but none of them is allowed to be the real name, the final revelation, the ultimate reality. But that's where the Bible is. That's where Deuteronomy is. There's an unavoidable clash between pluralism and the agenda of this biblical text, actually the agenda of the whole Bible. According to Deuteronomy, there are some God names that cannot be tolerated alongside the name of the Lord. Do it his way. Get rid of of other names. Why is it that in the New Testament, and we read these words earlier on, Jesus is given by God, he is given the name above all names.